Hello and welcome to the Print Soft Cover. My name is Nishit Upadhyay, and today we have with us two very distinguished guests and a lovely book that they've co-authored, which is A Sixth of Humanity, Independent India's Development Odyssey. This book is a very formidable and data-rich history of independent India's political economy, and of course, brilliantly and lucidly looks at all the paradoxes that have been there in India's development journey. Dr. Devesh Kapur is the Star Foundation Professor of South Asia Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and Dr. Arvind Subramanian is Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. He has also served as the Chief Economic Advisor to the Indian government. Thank you so much, both of you, for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for joining us. Professors, I'd like to start by asking a question that you actually have asked of yourselves at the beginning of the book. And of course, you've answered it as well. But for the benefit of those who haven't read this book, why write a book looking back at independent India's development odyssey, the entire 75 years? And why write it now? Dr. Subramanian, if you could take that question, please.
Yeah, that's how we begin the book. Why this book and why now? And I guess for a number of reasons. First of all, of course, if you scan the literature on both political economy, economics of Indian development, we found that either the books that were similar are now kind of out of date. For example, the great Bhagwati and Desai volume was written in 1974, or actually there was not really anything that took such a comprehensive view of development. So that's the sense in which Devesh is a political scientist, international relations expert. I'm more a kind of a hardcore economist. We had the sense that in academia now, the focus is to get more and more narrow and to be siloed in your approach to things. We wanted to kind of take a comprehensive view. But the real reason is that we genuinely believe that to understand Indian development, you have to, what we call, the four elements that make development. How do you build a nation? Especially a new nation which comes out of these very difficult circumstances. How do you build a state, or rather, how do you convert a colonial state into a development state? How do you build institutions? How do you create an economy? And of course, how do you transform society? Because Indian society has been such a challenge for so many things. And to do all of this in the context of democratic politics, which India was had embraced early on, that to us was, the real reason to do this book, to get a comprehensive view of development for such a complex, large, and diverse society such as India.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Kapur, one of the central themes of the book, the string that runs through the entire book, of course, is India being a precocious democracy, right? You mentioned how at the time of independence, Jawaharlal Nehru said that the soul of the nation had found an utterance, right? And you also, of course, write that the idea of a nation wasn't really a settled reality. Could you shed some light on how India, being a precocious democracy in the beginning, in the formative years of independent India, contributed to nation building?
So, we use the word precocious in the sense of something that was relatively earlier in a comparative context, meaning that almost no country of India's size had given universal franchise at such a low level of development. So what we show is that, look, there was the quintessential Western path, which is the co-evolution of economic development and the gradual extension of the universal franchise. Then there is the East Asia model, where economic development comes first and universal franchise, the democracy, follows. The third model is, of course, China, where you have rapid growth but no the democracy. India's was very distinctive in the absolutely low level of per capita income, low levels of literacy, etc., at which universal franchise came. Now, what we show in the book among the threads is what the democracy gave, but also that it had consequences for development choices. And the core argument we have is that, look, when you think about nation building, again, going back to the quintessential Western idea of which comes from Europe, was that the nation state was built around a single language and a single religion. India simply did not have that option. So actually, democracy and universal franchise becomes one of the principal tools of sort of nation building. And that is very distinctive about the Indian experience. And then, of course, it has sort of consequences for economic development.
Right. Dr. Subramanian, Dr. Kapur just spoke about the consequences for
Yeah.
economic development. And, you've said before that the first 30 years since India gained independence, by most accounts, most accounts have had a far too charitable view of what India's economic growth was in the first 30, 40 years. Could you shed some light on why you say that, and how the fact that we were speaking about precocious democracy, how did it contribute to the nascent economy of that time?
A very good question. So, the first 30 years, of course, has been written about, the planning model and everything. Tomes have been written about it. But I think there were a couple of new things that we wanted to shed light on that period. One was the basic assessment of the performance itself. And second were, the choices, policy choices that were made, and how did they relate to democracy as such, right? So the first, this it's kind of now the wisdom or the maybe the consensus view now today that given India's difficult circumstances, the performance was not that bad. We did about 3.5% growth, about 1.5% per capita, and this was actually better than the 30 years preceding it, i.e., prior to independence. Independent India did better than colonial India in the last 30 years. So in that sense, it's not too bad given the circumstances. So what we show in the book is that if you look at it comparatively, across time and space, across exact and countries, what you find is that the first 30 years, India actually, it was, let's say, in the, bottom 30th, third percentile. Between 50 and 80, it actually slipped even further in a relative sense around the world. But we try and sharpen that by contrasting India with China in that same period. Right. What is remarkable is that these were two countries that around 1950 were in a similar situation. And over the course of the next 30 years, China experienced massive economic and political instability, the kind of instability you would think is very, after all, as everyone has said, one of the, order is a precondition to development, and China just didn't have that. And India, despite having had that, did, between 50 and 80, on social indicators, health indicators, agricultural productivity, and even per capita GDP, if you compare with 1960, the fortunes changed quite a bit. So that kind of poses the first thing about we should think anew about. And by the way, not just that, in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of structural transformation, in terms of global export market share, everything India deteriorated in that period. So the performance of that period, I think, has to be revisited. Now, the second question is policy choices and how democracy impacted on that. First and foremost, we show, of course, that we weren't able. One of the reasons we were set back was because our agricultural productivity, although decent in that period, was nowhere close to what India needed, given how much of the population was living in agriculture. And that in turn had to do with the fact that we weren't able to implement major and really meaningful land reforms, except for a few states. And that, of course, had to do with the fact that democracy, and especially the Congress, was close to the West landed interests, and therefore, especially at the state level. And remember, land reform was a state level thing, and therefore that got impeded by that. In fact, one of the lines we have in the book, quoting Pratap Mehta, is that, the price of democracy is the absence of revolution, and that's the thing. But there were two other choices which I think we made, which one of them had certainly had very little to do with democracy, and the other one I'll let Devesh speak about. See, in our view, one of the most damaging things that we did in that period, see, we adopted planning, we emphasized the public sector, and we closed ourselves to foreign trade. But these were choices that many, many countries around the world made at that time. Latin America, Africa, China, even Europe went in for status model. So that was not, I think, a terribly bad choice or an unusual choice. But over and above that, we stymied up private sector. The whole aim of import substitution was to develop the private sector, and via licensing and all kinds of laws and regulations. And I think that set us back completely. And that had very little to do with democracy. That was just an ideological choice that we made. But the third choice is on education, and there Devesh should speak to that, democracy and education. Devesh?
Yeah, so early on, there was a clear recognition that India's massive illiteracy was not only a challenge to the empowerment of citizens, but of course was also an impediment to broader economic development. Yet we know that despite that recognition, India's record on primary education was really quite abysmal. And it's only from the early 90s, when India was really embarrassed internationally, when there was a sort of world conference on education, that India had the world's largest number of illiterates, that you begin to get change. Now, so we look at, and how others have also written, why did India, despite that recognition, not sort of undertake? And we know, of course, there were exceptions. Kerala comes to mind, but that was an exception. So, one view, and it's an excellent book by Myron Wiener on the child and the state in India, puts the focus entirely on India's sort of elites. Basically, the elites were upper caste, the policymakers, the widespread illiteracy was, of course, much more among the lower caste, so they didn't really care about it. And there's, of course, a lot of truth in that. But more recently, work has shown in a comparative context around the world that primary education actually expanded much faster under authoritarian governments meaning prior to universal franchise than after universal franchise. And there are a number of reasons why that's the case. So in that sense, because elite resistance was one that is much greater in a democracy. So we know, for instance, communist governments, whatever the record on economic development, but around the world, public health, primary education, that is one thing that most of them actually tend to do much better. So I think what we show is that there were two big consequences of a choice of early universal franchise. One was land reforms,
Mhm.
and the other was the severe under provision of primary education.
Right. Uh, Dr. Kapoor, in the first part of the book, I mean, you talk about the Hobbesian state, right? I mean, the fact that I mean, the argument is that basically India was able to establish order, right? But when it comes to law, enforcing law and accountability, maybe there wasn't so much success. Right? Do you think in today's, even in today's time, we are a state that is strong enough to preserve order, but not strong enough to ensure justice to its people?
I don't. So I think the first part is right. It is strong enough to preserve order. It is strong enough to provide law, to provide rule of law, but it chooses not to. So what we say is that look, the weakness the uh, of the rule of law has been a choice by our political elites. And by that I mean that, from the 50s onwards, every decade we show there's a report on, you know, how much the police is underfunded, how much cases are piling up in courts, and there are recommendations that are not that expensive. Every decade they are ignored. And this has happened, we show, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. It's been debated endlessly. Everyone recognizes. So if everyone recognizes it, it's not that expensive. Why is it not done? And it's not done because we show it's called, what we argue is it is strategically engineered weakness.
Right.
You have the money to spend. We show tens of thousands of crores on state-owned enterprises that bleed red ink, but you're unwilling to put a few hundred crores every year more to strengthen the lower courts. And that, of course, is, our focus always jumps to the Supreme Court when we think about that. And, the papers report all of that. The vast majority of citizens, you have a land dispute, you go to the lower court, you don't go to the Supreme Court, right?
Right.
And that is something we sort of show that. And that is also very harmful for business, which is why, for instance, on enforcement of contracts, India ranks in the bottom quartile of countries. Now, you know that for business and commerce, enforcement of contracts is a prerequisite for the effectiveness of markets. And if you so we've ignored these basics, which is also why, India has a very low incarceration rate, but there's a massively high rate of people who are incarcerated who are under trials. And they continue to be under trials because the case has not been heard in court.
Right.
So just to add a couple of things to what Devesh said about. See, the first thing is that I think we should be a little bit careful is that the claim we make is that not India provided order, but that it avoided disorder. And because saying order is a very strong statement, and I think one should be a bit careful about that. And it's you can see that even today, even if you look around the region, so many states, neighbors are suffering disorder, and we haven't. The second thing to say is that, to emphasize, is that it is not just political disorder that we avoided, but also economic disorder. I mean, we take for granted, in India, low inflation, lack of financial crises, because when you look around the world, at least in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, if you look around the world, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, even East Asia went through this major crisis. India avoided this. Basically, after 91, we've not had a major financial crisis, and our inflation rates have been amongst the lowest in the world. The last point, I think, you can be either upbeat or pessimistic about this whole order question, right? And Devesh was rightly pointing to the fact that you don't have justice, all of those things. But then the upbeat view of this is to say that, look, achieving order, or avoiding disorder, the macro order, even though there were lots of things, is something that very few countries around the world have managed to do around the world. And there too, I think democracy had an important role to play. So the accomplishment of democracy, sustaining democracy, was a major achievement. But kind of the many instrumental uses of achievements of democracy, what Devesh said earlier about nation building, but also about maintaining order, is something that I think we should not underestimate about the Indian development experience.
Absolutely. I mean, as you said, in terms of economic instability, you were talking about China, 60s, 70s. I mean, it was just crazy for them. We have not had instability to that extent. Dr. Kapur has also previously spoken about how, I mean, in a democracy like India, I mean, there wasn't bloodshed to the extent that many other countries have seen. So, of course, I mean, those are I mean, shining parts in the entire story. But I mean, I'd like to come to a very important thing in my next question, and which is something that, of course, resonated with me a lot, as it does with many other Indians, and it stays with them, which is complexity. Right. I mean, you've quoted, of course, the GST on popcorn example. You've also spoken about a very interesting anecdote, which I thought was very stunning, which is that Nitish Kumar was once asked about, I mean, the number of slabs of electricity rates in the state, and he didn't know the answer. His bureaucrats didn't know the answer. Someone guessed 4 to 5, and stunningly, there were 150. Right? I mean, where do you think this complexity took root in the India development story? How did it really steep in? And this, of course, this question is to the both of you. Where did it come in?
So Devesh, can I take this?
Yeah. You take it first, and then I'll.
Yeah. I think in the book, we have the penultimate chapter is called Pathologies and Paradoxes, and in that we have this as one of the pathologies, this love of complexity. In fact, I would say that I would urge readers to also we talk about a particular the fertilizer subsidy and describe it in all its complexity, and then and we write it in the past tense. But then we end saying this is not the past. This is actually the fertilizer subsidy regime as it prevails today. Now, and we see it across the board. I mean, numerous examples. Who is a deserving beneficiary? What is a poor person? All these now the origins, I think, are just speculating. What we say in the book are a couple of things, right? One is, I think, has to do with the fact that we always had multiple objectives to meet, right? So once you have multiple objectives, then by definition, you're going to, in a democracy, you're going to try and accommodate all these multiple interests, and that's going to lead to this. So for example, I was, somewhat part of the GST deliberations. Why did the rate structure get so complex? Well, because, you have 27 states. One state says tobacco is important to me. The other state says, cars are important to me. And quickly, the beauty about, or the fault or the beauty of democracy is accommodation. In fact, Granville Austin said the animating feature of Indian democracy is not compromise, but accommodation. So once you get into this multiple objectives, interact that with democracy, you get this. I think there's the other thing which is related to the other pathology we speak about, is this my-bapism, and the sense that the state can actually do these things to meet these multiple objectives. So it's some combination of democracy, accommodation, multiple interests, and this innate what we call my-bapism, which I think makes bureaucrats and policymakers feel that they can, in fact, that they have lots of instruments at their disposal, and therefore they can, pick and choose. They can, use it like a scalpel to, meet multiple objectives, satisfy multiple interests.
Right. Dr. Kapoor?
I think I don't have like much to add to what Arvind said. I think it's something we we discussed at length amongst ourselves into understanding why this love of complexity, and in particular, and also its consequences, because
Right.
what happens is that implementation becomes much harder and accountability becomes much harder, because once you have, and we show that in the chapter on state-owned enterprises, right, where even though we show just how costly it was for India, nonetheless you could always say, but they developed backward areas, but they gave employment, but they did this, etc., etc. So the the we underestimate just how costly in the aggregate complexity is, because we assume that the Indian state's implementation capacity is great, which of course it is not. So if your implementation capacity is sort of limited, you should also have limited goals. Do a few goals well rather than many goals not so well. But we've always chosen the latter over the former. Now, why that's the case, it almost seems to be now become part of our DNA, you know, and this begins in planning and licensing, which of course we know was incredibly complex, but it also extends to the social side, and reservations is one thing, right? We began with a clear thing, SCST, but the manner in which it has expanded, and this group, but you have this subclause for this particular group, etc. So now it's so incredibly complex, and once something is incredibly complex, it's also very hard to undo.
Right.
Now to say that there'll only be three rates for electricity tariffs, because now you have created sort of vested interests in each of the sub groups that have got something. So the consequences of this are larger than one might think.
So I just want to emphasize something that Devesh said. Devesh put it as, consequences of this, right? But I think the important point that Devesh is also making is that, the complexity becomes a cover for lack of accountability as well, as
Yeah.
exactly as you said. That once you say, multiple objectives, you say, but your returns are low, but say, no, but we did other things, or don't judge us just on the returns, judge us on this as well. And I think we really underestimate how costly this has been across the board. It's not just one sector, it's across the board, and it's been very, very damaging for India.
Right. But would you say that it was a lack of imagination, lack of ideas, or were we just playing too safe?
You might say it was extraordinary some sort of imagination.
Yeah, because it's true that, if you look at the industrial licensing regime which first began, you cannot make things up as creatively as the Indian
Correct.
babus did. I mean, you kind of say, just to give one example, I think there are many, many. In order to get a license, uh, the public sector enterprise that was competing with that license thing had a kind of veto say over that license being given. So I think that it is fiendishly imaginative that our policymakers have been over the years. So it's not see, but the other, just to be fair, the last point I'll make is what I remembered is that, see, Uh, One of the things about the book, is that, uh, you know, 3,000 government reports over 30 years. I should say we, but Devesh mostly has read all of them. And one of the things that came out from that report is that the Indian state was completely aware of all this, even the complexity. If you look at the licensing, people say this is god awfully complex. But the thing about the Indian state, and this is a line we say, is that the Indian state has been remarkably self-reflective and even self-diagnosing. It's even been self-flagellating. If you look at this, say, why do we do this? We should change this. This is bad, etc. But it has rarely been a self-correcting state.
Yeah.
And I think that aspect, and why that's the case, we can go into. But I think, to be fair to the Indian state, it's not as if it hasn't recognized it.
Basically, the diagnosis is there, but there's no treatment.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The treatment has been, elusive mostly.
Yeah. I want to come next to jobs, which is, of course, always a very evocative issue. Politically, policy-wise, socially, economically, you talk about how basically, despite decades of reforms and multiple efforts and steps, we don't have a robust job-creating industrialization, right? You also talk about the services and manufacturing debate and the balance between the two. What would you have to say about jobs and this debate between services and manufacturing? And I want to ask this question in light of Trump's world. What happens now?
Arvind, you want to start, and then I'll follow.
Okay. See, I think this is like, we can spend hours on this, but I think two or three things. Remember that when we talk about a jobs crisis now, we've always had a jobs crisis.
Yeah.
We show in the book that, formal sector, decently paid jobs with, whatever protections, whatever, has been less than 10% of the working age population forever and ever. It's increased a little bit in recent times. But so we've always been failed at creating jobs for the vast swathes of the population. Point one. Point two, of course, is that it's directly related to the fact that we chose a development strategy that initially emphasized the public sector, heavy industry, capital-intensive industries, to the neglect of labor-intensive industrialization, which has been the path out of industrialization for a very long time. So, and we spend a whole chapter on why is it that we never got the job creation? See, because readers should be, or viewers should be, aware of the following: that in the first 30 years, when we, crushed our private sector, etc., the question of why we didn't create jobs is not a very interesting question, because, we did all these things. The real paradox or puzzle is, when after we liberalized, all the things that we didn't do, but we did, despite all that, and despite getting very rapid growth for 30, 35 years, why is that even in that era of rapid growth, we didn't get jobs? Right? So we spend a whole lot of time saying why we didn't get the structural transformation and low-skill manufacturing. And just 2-3 points, which then comes to the services and manufacturing question. One, initially, we never had the agricultural productivity growth that the East Asians did. Because above all, what this did was, not only did it put income in the hands of vast swathes of the population, initially, those incomes were directed to labor-intensive goods. So we didn't have that, agriculture leading to a demand for low-intensive goods, right? Then, of course, our regulatory environment was impeded manufacturing and large-scale manufacturing. We also had, something that's neglected is that our electricity sector, and even our, these non-tradable inputs that go into manufacturing production, we've been highly inefficient. Just we have an example in the book. The price of electricity was at least double what it should have been. And think of the contrast. When we liberalized our telecommunications, our services revolution followed. We didn't do electricity, and therefore the manufacturing sector transformation was stymied. Last point I will say is that the interplay between services and manufacturing has been a very interesting one, I think, right? One, we had the services revolution. But point number one is that it can never provide the jobs that manufacturing can, because it's very, very, in fact, if you look at the PLFS today, high skilled jobs are about 1 to 2% of the labor force. That's what it's. The second, I think, more, I think, consequential aspect, which is the more and more controversial thing, is that not only we argue in the book that services and the government sector both played a role in holding back manufacturing. So it's like a Dutch disease. There were two kinds of Dutch, because when the services sector did very well, our exchange rate was much stronger than it otherwise would have been. Some of the labor market, the wages were very high. That held back manufacturing. Similarly, the government sector, a big player in the labor market, jobs at the lower end, the wages at the lower end very high. That also made manufacturing very unprofitable. So it's a long-winded way of saying that services and manufacturing, services can never provide the jobs. Manufacturing can, but services can also stymie the creation of manufacturing jobs. And of course, I've spoken too long. So Devesh, on the Trump thing, why don't you talk about it, and maybe I'll come back later. Sorry for a long-winded answer.
No. So just to continue on what Arvind said, look, this whole thing of manufacturing versus services is a false dichotomy. A country the size of India absolutely has to run on both legs. It cannot be either or. See, what we show in the book is this real puzzle, right? Given the imperative of jobs, why is it that public policy and the political class chose policies that almost always penalize the creation of jobs? Right. One is it's always been against large manufacturing employers. So if you just see the average size of plants which Arvind has worked on in, say, garments, etc., or labor intensive manufacturing, whether it's shoes or toys or garments, the size of the plants in China compared to India is order of magnitude higher. Right. The factor markets that matter for manufacturing, land, labor, electricity, we ensured were much more expensive. Now, labor, people talk a lot about, to the labor market, regulations, all of that. But we show that a big distortion in the labor market is government labor markets. Think of the literally tens of millions of young people who spend years trying to study and get in the civil service exams, which the likelihood that any one of them is maximum we show is about 1%. 99% of them will have spent the best years of their lives studying for an exam which will equip them with no skills for the broader economic market, right? And because we have also ensured that at the lower rungs of government employment, wages are way higher than comparable private sector. Why should I, try and work in a factory if I can get a government job as a peon, which will pay me multiple times as much with job security and everything else, right? So if we show a comparison, think of West Bengal versus Bangladesh, right?
Right.
At the time of independence, West Bengal was the most industrialized state. East Pakistan had almost no industries, right? Look at the way Bangladesh has become a global garment exporter powerhouse. But West Bengal has not managed anything close, right? And so, two states, a natural experiment, even now, 3 decades of stability of left front, even now in Bengal, there is almost no attempt to attract the very sector that your neighbor is doing. Uh, and we show that there is almost no recognition of what it takes to build a strong labor intensive manufacturing sector. It still is to attract, you know, fancy service sector companies in IT, or about capital intensive manufacturing, but not labor intensive manufacturing. And it doesn't matter which political party is there.
But we didn't answer the last part of your question,
Okay,
which is
yeah.
the Trump thing, right?
Yeah.
See, but all that having been said, I think certainly I was very hopeful over the last 2 3 years that the China plus one shock
Mhm.
would give India one last opportunity to reclaim this labor intensive manufacturing, which, for all the reasons Devesh and I just said, we hadn't been able to. And to some extent, it was beginning to happen. If you look at, for example, Apple
Yeah,
is now
yeah,
firmly in India,
yeah.
and it is, its future is, it's made it clear that, progressively it's going to. So the question was, why can't we attract more and more? And it was beginning to happen, especially in the southern states, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka. And the other very promising sign was that not just Apple, but companies in footwear and textiles, those plant sizes were actually becoming bigger and bigger. In Tamil Nadu, for example, there are 10,000 employment plants, 20,000, 40,000 even. So the whole scale thing, which we were, really, the phrase we use is that we basically had midgets making widgets in India, but that's changing now, right? So things were beginning to change to some extent, and certainly. But then the Trump tariffs have come along, and I think that is very, very damaging for India. See, because people are saying, "Oh, how much is the export going to go down because of the tariff?" But that's a very narrow way of looking at. It's the investment that would have come had we had lower barriers in the US, because it was because of that all these companies were coming to India. And take clothing, for example, take India's largest clothing manufacturer. 55 to 60% of his market is the United States. So the notion that we can somehow make it up elsewhere, etc., partially we can, but not having access to the labor market. Because today, by the way, India's tariffs are greater than those of China in the US market. So bottom line is that, we didn't do very well for a long time. There was a glimmer of opportunity with the, China plus one, but now the Trump tariffs have really set that opportunity back. And so I still hope we will resolve this issue in a way that will give us one last chance at doing labor intensive manufacturing in the country. But see, because, sorry, go ahead, Devesh, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I just want to add, I do think that the Trump tariff is, of course, a clear, potent threat, as Arvind. But there are two longer term things happening that also cause for
Worry.
um, considerable worry. One is the effects of AI on our services exports in the
Yeah.
tech sector. The other is the incredible advancement of sort of robotics in labor intensive manufacturing, which is why China continues to be very competitive in what used to be labor intensive sectors. China has installed more robots than the rest of the world combined, right? Both of them, one in labor intensive manufacturing, the other in high end services, in addition to the Trump tariff threats, the joint effects of these three are going to be severely challenging.
So just, I mean, I know one last, just to follow
Yeah,
up
of
on
course.
Devesh said, you see, because it's very important, right? I mean, the robotic part is true. The labor potential of even labor-intensive manufacturing is going to be much less than it was in the past, and Devesh is absolutely right on that. But I think this is what why for me we should not give up on this, right? Take India's global export market share in labor-intensive manufacturing. It's like 3%. It peaked at about 5, it's down to 3. China was 40, 45, 50 even at times, right? We will never go from 3% to 20%. I think we're deluding ourselves, but we can go from 3% to 10, 12%.
Yeah.
And that, even with the reduced employment opportunity because robotics, still offers the only glimmer of providing labor-intensive manufacturing in India. So that's point one. But I think the second point, which I think for me is very important, is that, look, Devesh and I, we do feel very strongly that all the things that we've catalogued about what governments and states haven't done in India, a lot of it has to do with just the lack of political imagination. People do things involuntarily. We did it in the past. Reservations, we did continue with reservations because that's the default instrument that you're comfortable with or you believe in. But to me, if, for example, Tamil Nadu and Andhra and Karnataka can attract Apple and Foxconn to come into India,
Yeah.
I mean, it has to awaken the imagination of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar,
Yes,
which
yes.
have lower wage costs than Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, and Karnataka. So they have to then say, or they can start thinking that, wow, this is an opportunity. So the spread of that imagination within India is another reason why I feel very, bit anxious about, but also believe in the basic, opportunity afforded by the last gasp of opportunity afforded by labor-intensive manufacturing.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, in fact, Google has just announced a project that will invest billions of dollars in a data center, right?
But that too in Andhra Pradesh. It's in Andhra Pradesh. The
Exactly,
point
that's
is
in
that
Andhra
we need
Pradesh.
this to
And
spread to UP, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh,
yeah,
Rajasthan.
yeah.
But the main
And
thing is
all,
it's also very capital intensive. It
yeah,
is not going to provide many jobs.
yeah,
Now it will, I mean, to be fair, we really don't know how AI will affect productivity, more broadly, because the real effects of AI will be in the user industries, all of that. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. And look, broadly, any investment is good. I mean, in a general sense,
yeah.
but since the bulk of the challenge is in the north and in the east, right? Also because of demographics, that's where we really want to see this imagination, as Arvind said, spreading.
Okay. The next question I want to ask is, and I just did it with you, right? You write in the book that the expectation from the book and from you as authors is basically to speak to big picture questions, right? Will India become a developed nation by 2047? Will it become a superpower, right? And you say that you'd like to use a metaphor, which is the air pollution, to basically refer to something like this. I mean, I'm sitting in Delhi right now. It's all around us, and it's a health emergency, right? At this point, could you just quickly talk about how you think the problem of air pollution is indicative of how many other national challenges could be tackled?
Maybe go.
So, I mean, think of air pollution in Delhi. One, this is a problem for which I think the Supreme Court first started to look at it. I think, if I recall, in the late 80s is the first, right? So 3 to 4 decades it's been going on. Mounting evidence of the incredible cost on human health, on mortality rates, on morbidity rates. Delhi, this is affecting not some poor part of India that nobody knows. It's affecting where all the political elite live, from Supreme Court to Parliament to the entire executive branch, right? They breathe it, their children are breathing it, their grandchildren are breathing it. So they all know. So why is it that an issue that everyone is abundantly aware of. Every year we know it's going to happen. Everyone is facing the consequences. And year after year, you have basically very limited sort of effectiveness, as you can see with the persistence of the problem, right? This is not to say that nothing was done or nothing was tried, but broadly speaking, it's been singularly sort of ineffective. So what we sort of say is that, look, this is symbolic of what we call the sort of that in the path to development there'll be these wicked problems, severely challenging ones, which require not only the central government but different parts of the central government to coordinate. It requires the contiguous states next to Delhi. So it requires what Arvind has earlier sort of talked about in is sort of cooperative federalism. It requires the involvement of society, from people who drive polluting cars to farmers that burn crop residues. It requires changes in agriculture policies, that you don't grow rice, which is not only destroying the water table, but because of rice residues to plant the wheat crop, it leads to this burning problem. So it requires just a degree of coordination across levels of government, across different actors in society, across different parts of the Indian state run by different political parties, and to build not just a consensus on policy, but on implementation, right?
Right.
Clearly, that is the same thing that India will have to do if it has to change electricity pricing or fertilizer policies, or build rule of law and invest in lower courts, or a better police force. All of these are long standing challenges. All of these are very costly to the Indian people and its economic development efforts. And that's what we sort of show, that look, very strong cooperative federalism, if you don't have, it'll be much, much harder, because they cannot be solved by a single actor.
Right. Dr. Kapur, you just spoke about cooperative federalism, and how a problem like air pollution needs a multidisciplinary approach, but also, uh, while many aspects of the central government, also other contiguous states have to basically work on it, right? One theme that is very important to note in the book is that when you write a big picture book like this, you talk about the union government, the central government, or as a whole, as a collective, how India is tackling something. But the two of you have gone into great detail about the states, right? Individual states. And why did you think it was compelling to speak individually, respectively, about states? Was the sum greater than all the parts? Why was it so important to speak about the states so specifically?
So
I
just,
mean,
Harvey, if I can just add one, and then you.
Sure.
So very, I think initially what we saw was many of the challenges that India's citizens face are with regard to the provision of basic public goods, right? Water, footpaths, pollution, garbage, data,
education, health.
policing, public health, public education. Constitutionally, they are all state subjects. So, if you want to start at the very basic about, public welfare requires strong provision of public goods, which in turn is really the purview of state governments and local governments, not the national government. So that is what led us to a greater focus on states. So, Arvind?
So I think there's a broader point I'd like to make, building on what Devesh said. We've set this book in a comparative framework. comparing India with other countries. So it helps us to understand India better, but I think it also helps us to either understand development more broadly better, or at least identify what the development literature lacks and what the Indian experience highlights that it lacks. So, to both Devesh and me, when we were chatting about this, that when development is discussed more broadly, the notion that development has to be seen, especially with countries like India, in a federal context, i.e., you have decision making with the center, with the states, jointly, and then that's cooperative federalism. But also within a state, you have competitive federalism. Famously, China experimented with some regions and then built on that experience for other regions. So there's a much broader message about looking at the states, because this is about understanding development in a federal system where there's so many things going on at so many different levels. So I think it's a broader point that a federal democracy has to be understood in ways quite different from just looking at the center, as it were. That's point one. The second point I would say, which is just coming from the book itself, is that one of the things that Devesh and we show in the book, and what Devesh just said, is many of, not just what the states were in charge, but many of the failures were because state governments did not deliver. Devesh mentioned sanitation, health, education, but you can also talk about law and order, justice. If the Supreme Courts function poorly or not so great, the state district courts function much worse. If the Union Public Service Commission is generally okay, state public service commissions tend to be much more riddled. Central Finance Commission works well, but state finance commissions much more tardy, delayed, less implemented. So there's a line in the book where we say that whatever the center may do not so well or badly, the states do much worse. So it's the whole question of why that is the case, which we only kind of touch upon. We don't really provide a great answer or a convincing answer on, is it because of lack accountability gets worse at the state level? But these are issues, I think, that require much more attention. The last point I would say is that, one of the things looking at the states showed us is that, which is one of the findings in the book, is that when we talk about the India-China comparison, we think of China as this growth miracle and India as having done reasonably well in the last 35, 40 years, but nowhere close to being the Chinese growth miracle. But when we looked at the data, you find that 1/3 of India actually was like a Chinese growth miracle. It grew almost as fast as China and for almost as long. So that again raises, questions about why is it that, some parts of India can do it and not other parts. And that naturally lends itself to more state level granular analysis as well. So for all these reasons, I think, when we speak about India, or at least large countries, large nations, a kind of federal perspective where you look at all the constituent elements is almost, a prerequisite for analysis.
Right. Thank you. I have many more questions, but we're a little short on time, so I'll just move on to the last two questions. One, of course, the first of them is that do you think that the Indian democracy at some point stopped evolving? Is that true? And if you were to pick one phase or one point, and if that is so at all, what would you say was the coming of age of the Indian democracy? Dr. Kapur, if you'd like to take that.
Devesh, the difficult question.
No, so I think the point at which, and I don't want to talk of a particular time, but I think it stopped evolving was when democracy was reduced to elections. And the other many elements that go into sustaining a healthy democracy began to get underemphasized. So one is the health of civil society, uh, mechanisms of accountability other than elections, which is India's broader institutions. Uh, I first began to work on the weakening of India's institutions in the almost more than two decades ago,
Mhm.
uh, and I think to me there were two elements that are worrying. One is, and this was a weakness in the constitution itself, that you cannot have democracy without elections. You cannot have elections without money. It's expensive. And as we've added now local elections, right? We elect about 3 million people are elected in India. Uh, each of those elections costs money. And we really have no good answers on election finance, which of course has meant a lot more corruption because you need to raise that money. A second is that the you elections are fought by political parties. There is very we a small firm has to go through many more rules, regulations, reporting than
Yeah.
political parties. They are not transparent. They don't have to submit their accounts, or if they uh, or even if they are delayed, all of that. So the regulatory structure for everyone in India is strong, except the very entity that is essential for healthy democracy, which is political parties. And the third is that only reducing that, someone said that democracy requires a particular sensibility in the political elite, which is a sensibility about compromise, accommodation, all of that, right?
Mhm.
And as you can see with Trump, it's not that the US institutions have hugely changed, but if you have a political elite whose own sensibility is very authoritarian, then the elections per se can become a bit of a facade rather than the core elements of what it takes to sustain a healthy democracy.
So can I just add one thing to what Devesh said? See, the question that you posed is a very good one, but we should also not forget that this is not an Indian phenomenon per se, the weakening of democracy or institutions or whatever. It's a global phenomenon. Uh, and, just speaking about the United States, I mean, who would have thought that what we once considered was not just a country with a strong democracy, but with strong institutions would kind of deteriorate so rapidly and quickly, shows that, so this is not something that's unique to India alone. It's happening, it's happened all over the world, Hungary, Turkey, China, even UK under Boris Johnson, Brazil, South Africa, it's happened. So I think there's something bigger going on. Whether it's due to the rise of identity politics, people questioning what nations are, even the whole. So it's not just democracy,
Especially social media.
and of course the rise of social media. So I think this is something that, again, what the comparative perspective allows us to say is that, look, bad as it is, alarming and anxiety inducing as it is, it's not a uniquely Indian phenomenon. And therefore, we need to think about this a bit more broadly, even when we think about India.
Right. I'll move on to the last question of this interaction. We were just talking about it earlier when we were interacting before we began the conversation that, you write in the acknowledgement section that last year in 2024, early 2024, Milan Vaishnav of Carnegie, of course, gathered a group of people and there were deliberations and there were brainstorming as the book was taking its final shape. And there was a lot of valuable feedback, right? I mean, of course, in the lighter way, and I'm sure you also write that what that gathering did was that it saved you the fear of embarrassment. embarrassment of coming. I mean, if that were possible, of coming out with the book. What I want to ask was, what was the point? I mean, what was the thought process? What was the point at which the two of you sort of were convinced that you wanted to go ahead with this book? And what was the gap that you thought you wanted to fill with this book?
I see. First of all, I mean, in all these things, there's a lot more continuity than, kind of, important moments, as it were, right? I mean, so Devesh and I have been talking about many of the themes of this book: precociousness, democracy, etc., institutions, for a long time. And we have been working on this also independently of each other for a long time. And we've also been talking together. So the book, in some ways, has been taking shape, even without our knowing, for a long time. Point one. Point two, I think, is that what people don't realize is that before the 2019 election, Devesh and I wrote 100 pages of a book which was completely prescriptive, as it were. What should the next government do? A, B, C, D. And then I'm glad sanity and wise heads prevailed, because, as you know, in this book, we have completely steered clear of prescription, for all the reasons that we mentioned in the book. I think finally, I think that to us, or at least to me, and Devesh should speak for himself, I became convinced of at least the analytical framework when we said we have to look at this much bigger, this state, society, nation, markets in the context of politics, because I'm a more narrow economist, and I followed the economics literature where there's always, the opposition is state versus markets, or state versus society. The Nobel Prize winners have focused on this. But it struck me and struck both of us at some point that, to use our collective, expertise, and which is very complementary in some ways, to try and get this broader framework and present India in this broader framework would, I think, be, we would learn a lot from it, which is what ended up happening. And it's something that, it sheds light on India, but as we say, it also sheds light on how development should be viewed more broadly.
Right. Okay.
I don't have much to add other than, I think there are always parallel processes that go on. I think the conversations was a little bit of we were not a sort of dissatisfaction with the literature that was out there, which we often felt was either very narrow or, was very prescriptive. But in particular, as Arvind said, the realization that, look, young nations, don't do economic development without having to think about state and nation building, and how the bedrock of all of these processes is the nature, structure, and changes occurring in society itself, right? And so I think that sort of made us feel that, look, how should one think of the interrelationships among these and trying to integrate them into something, coming up with something that integrates them. And that was, I think, how the conversations sort of began to occur, of how one part affected the other and vice versa. And that's how this book began to gel.
And so just one last point to add is that, look, Devesh and I are both very, very, keen on data, new data, and so on, right? And, certainly my own experience of writing the economic surveys, when I was in government, I think certainly convinced, but also whetted the appetite for saying that, can we do something that's data-driven, rich, somewhat dense because it's data driven, but yet at the same time can we make it accessible to a wide audience? So I think we very much wanted to take on that challenge, based on a broad feeling that maybe given what we've done in the past, we could somewhat rise to this challenge.
Dr. Subramanian, now that you mentioned the economic survey, I mean, it was such a pleasant surprise to read in the book that, the economic survey of 2017-18 got 20 million views from, I mean, across 175 countries. And it was, of course, it was a very heartening figure. Dr. Kapur,
But
Dr.
by the way, we want that for a bigger number for the book. And
as I'm sure you'll get it. But Dr. Kapur, Dr. Subramaniam, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. It was a lovely conversation, and congratulations once again on the book.
thanks so much
Thank
for
you
having
again.
us.
Thank you. Thank you.